I'm Russell, and this is The Science of Self, where you learn to improve your life from the inside out. Today is Thursday, October 27th, 2022. From Peter Holland's book, Old School Grit, we take another look back at history, this time to Alexander the Great. Let's take a look at a story of Alexander the Great and a small city called Tyre that was founded in around 2750 BC. The city was on an island, and on the mainland was another settlement called Ushu. Tyre was, from a strategic perspective, an important commercial seaport, and throughout ancient history, it was invaded and controlled in turn by basically every European culture that surrounded it at the time. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great, who was hell-bent on conquering nothing less than the entire world, set his eyes on Tyre. His historic campaign from Macedonia had already left a string of subjugated towns and villages in his wake. Then he got to Tyre. This was a problem. How would he invade and subdue a city on an island? It was easy work to take the mainland city of Ushu, but he was stumped about how to manage Tyre. There was no question of moving on without occupying the island, since this would expose his armies to ambush from the rear as they advanced. Now, if you think that this story is going to be one in which we discover the impressive military and strategic skill of Alexander, you'd be wrong. This is a story about impressive engineering feats. Today, geological scientists and historians have worked hard to examine the area today. The city is now called Sour, and study the landscape to try recreating what it was that Alexander and his army were facing at the time. The scientists realized that in Alexander's time, there would have been, lying a few meters under sea level, the answer to their problem, a narrow sandbar joining Tyre Island to the mainland. Over the course of 7 long and hard months, Alexander's formidable war machine set out to create a path to the island on top of this sandbar. They piled up stone, timber, and whatever rubble they could find to raise the sandbar above sea level so it could be walked on. This would have been an astonishing 220 feet in width alone. Considering the technology available at the time, hint, basically nothing, this achievement was especially striking. As it happened, the sandbar plan wasn't the main reason that Alexander was eventually able to lay siege to the city and claim it, but the skills the army developed were used again later on, when the same tactic was employed to create a bridge from the Egyptian mainland to the island of Pharos. Most fascinating of all, though, is the longer-term impact this land bridge made on the landscape. The bridge they built acted as a barrier against which silt slowly accumulated until it created the 700,000 square feet of new land now in the area. Aerial photos show that Tyre Island is not much of an island anymore and is connected by a broad peninsula to the mainland. It's incredible to imagine that an army led by a single man was responsible for altering the very face of the earth. Alexander the Great only lived to 32 years of age and never did achieve world domination as he had hoped. But today, thousands of years after his death, the land still shows the mark of the siege of Tyre. Plenty's been written about Alexander the Great. His full appellation was Alexander III of Macedon, and he was born in 356 BC. Succeeding his father, Philip II, as the king of the ancient Greek realm of Macedon. He succeeded his father, who was assassinated at the wedding of Cleopatra of Macedon. No, not that Cleopatra. And though just 20 years old when made king, he spent more or less all of his career on a vast military campaign to conquer Asia and Northeast Africa, and then later, the known world. Through Alexander, one of history's most immense empires was created, and he's still remembered today as being unbeaten in battle. If Alexander the Great seems to you to be a figure of almost mythical, non-human proportions, This is for a reason. He was tutored by the great Aristotle. I'm indebted to my father for living, but to my teacher for living well, and was known to be a military genius, the likes of which the world had never seen. It's hard to imagine how he had achieved so many noteworthy battles, sieges, and invasions at the age of just 30. He's a man who had 20 cities named after him. One, for example, is Alexandria in Egypt. Alexander is responsible for the spread of Greek culture, which morphed in time into Hellenistic civilization, out of which sprung the Roman Empire and the Western world we can recognize as such today. From the time of his death, every military leader of note would forever be compared to the gold standard that Alexander set. Military academies still admire and teach his distinctive tactics and strategies today. There are also plenty of other quasi-legends about the leader's childhood and private life. Plutarch related that on her wedding night, Alexander's mother, Olympias, dreamt that a bolt of lightning struck her womb and spread a flame that covered the entire world. His father, Philip II, was also reported to have prophetic dreams about his soon-to-be son. He saw a vision of himself putting a royal seal on Olympus's womb in the image of a lion. Ambitious Olympias is said to have believed literally and seriously in her son's greatness, reportedly teaching him from an early age that he was, in fact, the son of Zeus, and more than a mere mortal. Considering that her marriage to Philip was merely a political one, and that she resented her husband, we can understand why she might have convinced the boy that his real father was, in fact, a god. On the day Alexander was born, his father received news of an auspicious victory in the kingdom, and simultaneously that one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Temple of Artemis, had burnt down. Alexander was raised like any other noble Macedonian youth. He received a classical education and was taught to ride horses, hunt, fight, read, and play the lyre. Even as a youth, people recognized his vaulting ambition. After his epic but surprisingly short military career, Alexander died at just 32 from causes not yet fully determined, possibly alcohol, typhoid fever, or poisoning by his enemies. While all of this pomp and grandeur is certainly interesting, it's hard to imagine what a man that lived thousands of years ago could teach us about resilience, grit, and determination today. The world that Alexander lived in was very different from ours. He was born into luxury and privilege that most of us would associate with only the wealthiest celebrities today. Yet, he was also ostracized by his own court, and being ruler of the weakest kingdom, generally despised by the Greeks. There was even a time when Alexander and his mother were exiled from the kingdom because of political disagreements over Philip's subsequent son, the rightful heir, since Alexander could not be, being only half Macedonian. Alexander thus had a potent combination of 2 quite different experiences, the shame of being a half-blood and second in line to his younger brother, who would be king, but also the deeply held conviction that he was, in truth, destined for greatness. It doesn't take a psychologist to see that Alexander had an immense chip on his shoulder and would spend his entire life emphatically proving himself and his identity and searching for a place to call home. Can you imagine a person like this being made ruler of several vast and powerful kingdoms all over the world, including Egypt, where he was deemed a pharaoh and thus of divine origin? It's hard to picture a time in history when men worshipped rulers not merely as kings, but as literal embodiments of divinities. But this is the world that Alexander lived in. By the time he arrived at Tyre, then, he was already a formidable military force and believed completely in his title as the greatest living general to grace the earth, and probably a god as well. What could us mere mortals learn from this man who lived so extraordinary a life that it's hard to believe some of it's true? Are we supposed to conclude that monstrous narcissism and relentless aggression is what makes a person great? No, probably not. But Alexander the Great does show us just how much is possible when innate talent is paired with opportunity and a rock-solid self-belief. Try to put yourself in the mind of Alexander, who regularly took actions that affected not just hundreds of thousands of people in his own country, but hundreds of thousands more in far-off, exotic lands that most people could scarcely imagine, let alone conquer. Picture the sense of self-control, the size of his vision, and the gargantuan self-confidence it would have taken to believe genuinely that conquering the entire world was not only possible, but you had a plan to do it, and that plan was working. This gives us an insight into why Alexander acted as he did when it came to seizing Tyre. He saw an obstacle and found a way around it. The fact that his solution required thousands of men and several months' work was irrelevant. He did it. When the landscape was not amenable to his plans, he changed the landscape. So sure was his will, and so certain was his determination to get what he wanted, that he undertook a plan that had been unthinkable until then in military history. What's interesting is that in Tyre, Alexander proved that he was not just a military genius. He was a genius, period, and he was willing to do whatever it took to achieve his goals, whether that meant battle tactics or overseeing an audacious engineering project that modern builders would even balk at today. We cannot exactly call Alexander's response to the problem of Tyre adversity, and we can't frame his novel solution as an instance of resilience or overcoming adversity. Rather, we can see in Alexander's life that we need never frame anything standing in our way as an obstacle at all. It's merely something that we have yet to bend to our will. While an excellent but conventional military strategist might have thought, this is difficult. How could you lay siege to an island? The great Alexander simply decided, we'll have to make it so that it's not an island anymore. What could you achieve if you had even a fraction of the bombast and arrogance that Alexander did? How would you believe if the world knew your name and that name was routinely affixed with the Great? Chances are you'd take a lot more risks, feel a lot more secure in yourself, and crucially, face adversity in a completely new way. You may not even see it as adversity. In the modern world, many of us get overly attached to a kind of victim mentality and may create narratives for ourselves in which we are hard done by, set back, or unfairly treated by others, or life itself. It's as though we're the opposite of Alexander the Great. Instead, we walk around as though we're Michael the Puny or Jenny the Weak. When we encounter a difficulty, we panic. Even though we may not frame it this way, it can feel like life, like the gods themselves are standing in our way. But if you're Alexander the Great, you are a god. You are in charge. You can never be a victim, only an active agent. You decide. You identify your course and take action until it's achieved. You're not at anyone's mercy. And even when you face uncertainty, suffering, loss, or defeat, even this does nothing to reduce your dignity or self-belief. I would rather excel others in the knowledge of what is excellent than in the extent of my powers and domination, said Alexander. For this great man, his strength and conviction came from striving for the good, the noble, the virtuous. Despite being rightly viewed as a bloodthirsty warlord by many, he was also determined that every subject in his kingdom would be an equal, regardless of station, creed, or color. At the end of his life, he was believed to have said, "A tomb now suffices him for whom the whole world was not sufficient." Everyday example. Melissa would never consider herself to have anything in common with Alexander the Great, but she shares in his mindset when she decides one day to pursue her dream no matter what. Melissa dreams of working for a company she's admired from afar for years. But with little formal education and being a single mother to 2 young children, there's no way she could work there, even if by some miracle she convinced them to hire her. She takes an alternative route. Melissa strategizes and first angles for a lowly cleaning job at the company, and after being hired, gradually convinces management to let her implement a progressive child care center on site and be in charge of its operation. Impressed with her competence and vision, the same management soon agrees to mentor Melissa and give her career advice. Within a few short years, the perfect job opens up in the company, and Melissa has made sure she's first to apply and top of mind with the bosses who already know and like her. The best part? She now works at a company that provides on-site childcare. In other words, when she couldn't reach Tyre, she built a bridge. Alexander the Great's lessons. When facing an obstacle, don't get despondent or give up. Simply become curious about how you'll get around it. Take the fact that you will get around it as a foregone conclusion. Believe in yourself. No need to be a megalomaniac of Alexander the Great proportions, but don't allow others to tell you what you are and are not capable of doing. This, rather than self-pity and feeling victimized, can bless you with far more dignity and resilience. If your plans aren't working, change the plans. If the story takes a bad turn, change the story. If you're losing the game, change the rules of the game until you're winning. The most successful people in history didn't wait to be given permission to believe in their own competence. They just barged ahead and believed it anyway. If you love the science of self, we'd love for you to subscribe, rate, or give a review of this episode on whatever platform you find it. Thanks for being with us today, and we'll see you next Thursday.